Alrighty, we'll go ahead and get started. So today we're going to start talking about research and why that's important to figuring out personality. And as part of that, I have a little assignment I thought of this morning. So we'll see how it goes that we'll start the class off with. But first I'm going to take roll. So again, I'm trying to learn your names. Bear with me. I know some of you already, but some of you I haven't had. So Sue, there you are today. Brittany, Paula. Okay, and then I have the academic affairs of major professors like the Hogwarts all this semester. So I don't know what it is, but I have to give it to you. So who knows? You might all have one by the end of the semester. Okay, Katie. Jade. Elijah. Trinity. Your hair color, by the way, it looks great. Ariana, not here today. Allie. Bracken. Michaela. Jada. Griffin's not here. Jasmine, not here. Kira, awesome. And Riley, cool. Alrighty, so if you can do this alone or pair up with somebody or like do a group of 3. If you go to our Blackboard page, and let me go ahead and share screen so anyone who's following later can find this. So drag this out of my way. If you go to our Blackboard page, you'll see there's a new little link that says warm up on the side. And in there is a link to this assignment. And it's just something that shouldn't take you very long, but I'm trying to make all of my classes more interesting this semester. So that means not just me talking. So go ahead and you can do this by yourself or pair up with somebody with a laptop. And all I want you to do is to search for personality research on Google. And then if you're not familiar, so you go to Blackboard, and then now there is a new little link that says warm up. So I'm going to try to do different warm up activities and assignments for y'all. So we're not just, again, coming in cold and staring at me teaching. But if you search personality research on Google, and then you click this little thing at the top that says news, this will give you a list of recent news articles. And if you click, you can see there are just pages and pages of it. So, some people might want to click 3 pages in. And then what you're going to do, I already had it open. Oh, well. Is go ahead and copy paste the link to the article, do a quick summary of the findings from the study that the article is talking about, and then tell me whether you think the news article is actually reporting it well or not. So for example, you might find some news articles that are talking about correlational studies, and they're like, eating chocolate prevents dementia, when it's really just like a random correlation they found, right? So think about things like that. And you can just sort of create a list under here. There's no sort of formal way to put it in. But again, just a way to kind of jazz it up a little. And I will click away so that no one feels self-conscious about typing in front of everybody else. So again, go ahead and pair up with somebody, or if you want to do it by yourself, you can. I'll give you about 5-10 minutes to do it, and then we'll dive in. Yeah.
we have to use the link that you just dropped?
Oh, that was the.
Oh, I was like, what?
No, yeah. So we're doing a little warm up assignment, Griffin.
Okay.
So if you go to Blackboard, there's a new section called warm up,
Okay.
and there's a link to what we're doing. This is something I dreamed up this morning. We'll see how it goes.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm trying to be very,
Spontaneous.
yeah, I'm trying to be very transparent with y'all. I don't have everything figured out. Okay, so take like another minute or two and then we'll go through them.
And then we can talk about how it's like.
I want solar panels on that.
Alrighty, so I am going to open up the document. Looks like, wow, y'all are much more detailed than I was thinking. Go you, we've got overachievers, I love it. I was like, write a couple words, but y'all are awesome. Okay. So because you're writing a lot, let me give you another 2 minutes or so to finish up. I will always take more work rather than less, so y'all are awesome. Alrighty, anyone feel done enough to volunteer to go first? Awesome, okay, go ahead, Jade.
Okay. My article was 5 things your dream may say about your personality. So the article is talking about a lot of personality traits that one might have, including materialistic, introvert versus extrovert, emotional stability, how ready you are to experience new things, and your level of gratefulness. So apparently, it's talking about if you dream often of falling or death-related scenes, then you're more materialistic, or if you dream more of overcoming danger, you're not. If you dream more often, then you may be introverted, or if you dream less, you may be extroverted. If you dream more of being outside, then you're emotionally stable. Then if you dream of being inside more often, if you fly a lot in your dreams, then you're more likely to try new things. And last, if you dream a lot about different people, then you're more likely to be agreeable. I don't think this article did a very good job of being actively reported because it didn't have any statistics or like explaining how they figured these things out. It was just like, if you have this,
Right.
I feel like everyone at least once in their life has had a dream of like falling and you wake up and you're like, oh my god. But I don't think that automatically means everyone is materialistic.
Right.
So
No, that's such a good point. Yeah, and lots of different people have tried to like come up with like dream diaries, and Freud himself said there is no like one-to-one correlation with like this in your dream means that. So yeah, that makes sense. All righty, thank you very much. Anyone else feel ready to share? Everybody's like, no. Okay, thanks.
So mine was on 5 personality traits of self-made millionaires. It's basically saying that self-made millionaires have these 5 personality traits in common, which are risk-taking, emotional stability, openness, conscientiousness, and extroversion. It's also saying that they work on average 12 more hours a week than people people in the lower income distribution. And it said that wealthy people are more likely to take risks on investments, and that's why they're risk takers, and they have a longer life and better quality of life. And basically, I don't think it was very accurate. I mean, you can't just say that those 5 personality traits are just mutually exclusive to wealthy people. And wealthier people would more likely work more because they're earning more money, because it was about 12-hour difference. And that 12 hours could be a lot different in like money-wise. And then other people obviously have better access to healthcare, which would improve their quality of life. and their life.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Yeah, we need to keep in mind the systemic inequalities that come from just like being born wealthy. Like one of my favorite quotes was former President Trump saying, "My father gave me a small loan of $1 million." And all the rest of us are like, who with the what now? Like, that's a small loan, right? But for other people, it's a different perspective. It's like the news that came out about loan forgiveness, right? I mean, for a lot of people, it's not going to be your whole loan, right? But $20,000 is a lot of money. And there are a lot of wealthy people who are like, $20,000 are nothing. And I saw the best tweet over the weekend. I was like, if you think $20,000 is nothing, it is clear you've never been poor, right? Or honestly, middle class, right? Having grown up middle class, right? So yeah, perspective is a big piece of this. And yeah, generational things we know pass on. It's a lot easier to do well if your family is already wealthy, right? All right, who else? Yeah, Elijah.
My article was about identifying differences in personality between like younger and older generations. I didn't really go anywhere because there was nothing to do based on, and like people's personalities don't really change that drastic. Like it's gonna be, we have all chance to be different no matter how old. So it kind of just, they insert at the end, it's like, oh, it's mixed, and I was like, well, it's supposed to be but yeah, it's kind of concluded that they tried to like simplify personality into 5 different, like, 5 small categories and like compare it based on that. But they really just didn't get any kind of that. People are just different. Is what they concluded.
Right, right. Well, and it's really interesting. I'm glad that you used that one, just because a lot of times that article wouldn't get published because it didn't find differences, right? But I think that's really important that we publish stuff where there isn't any differences, right? This has been a problem in the research on gender, the research on race and ethnicity, where like the only things that get published are the things that show differences. And so all these times there are not differences, right? We're not talking about it. And so then we only hear the differences. We assume that these people are really different, when in fact, in a lot of cases, they're not. One of my favorite psychologists, yes, you have favorite psychologists when you're a professor, Janet Hyde, saw her at APA once, and she said, "I fight not with my fists, but with data," which I love. And she has done meta-analyses where she looks at like the gender differences research on large scales, and everything washes out. Basically, there are no consistent gender differences. And that's really important to look at too, right? Hey, guess what? We're all people. And like Elijah said, your personality kind of stays the same your whole life. All right. Other examples, and we don't have to do everybody's if everyone doesn't feel like talking today, but let's do 1 or 2 more maybe. I see people kind of side-eyeing each other. Yeah, go ahead, and then we'll do y'all, then we'll be done.
I did mine on whether or not genders influence one another's personalities with siblings, and they conducted this study with over 80,000 people in 9 different countries for several decades, but the data did say that it only affected siblings' personality just a little bit, but it didn't really provide any data or any like statistics to prove that behind it. They just basically were saying like facts from the data they collected, but there wasn't any like, proof from what they collected. So.
Yeah, and you're pointing out exactly one of the reasons why I wanted y'all to do this, which is that oftentimes what you see or what you would find on Google is some news reporter or blogger, if you pick up, usually not even the article, but a press release about the article and writes about it, right? And so they're not going to have all the info. If you really want all the info, you should track the actual article down, but of course, myself included, a lot of us don't do that, right? All right, we'll do this group and then we'll move on.
And it was done in 2 ways. First, it was a self-report, and the second was a fact report. And they saw that favorable traits were the same and unfavorable traits were seen more in the first report. So the self-report.
I think that's the findings are pretty fair, because biases and like different perspectives would change the like results of what they were before us. They were more it was like representing some big
Cool, yeah, we were actually, one of the readings in the pieces of the personality puzzle book is gonna use a similar technique that I think they'll do Friday, next week, I don't remember. Hey, look, I have a syllabus in front of me, I can tell you. We were gonna discuss that Friday, so one of the articles you're gonna look at says the same technique. It's a really interesting way to look at, because people don't always have an accurate perception of themselves, right? And then friends, you know, depending on how close they are, sometimes know us better than ourselves, right? So this is actually one of the reasons why, especially with people with like, let's say dementia, it's really good to have family or friends come in when they go to the doctor, because they can report things the person themselves doesn't notice. Very cool study, yeah. And so the whole point of this, and again, my brainstorm at like 8 this morning was not only to kind of break up the monotony of just me talking, but also thinking about how is the stuff we're going to talk about here being reported in popular press? Is it accurate? Do people understand research when they're reporting it? Sometimes it seems like they're doing a pretty good job, other times maybe not so much, right? And so today we're going to start talking about the ways we do research. And I know those of you who have taken intro and other 200 level courses, some of this will be review. But because psychology is a science and personality psychology is no exception to that, this is certainly an important area to make sure we cover in this intro section where we're talking about how do we come to the conclusions we have in personality. All right, so these are some of my favorite quotes. I think I referenced one of these on Friday. Just back in the day, the far day, BCE, they thought the brain didn't matter. The Egyptians, when they mummified bodies, would preserve lots of organs, but they would just yank the brain out and like throw it away. No one understood what the brain was for or what it did. And so obviously now, particularly in today's day and age, we're really trying to work on the frontiers of brain research. I don't know if folks remember this because it's 10 plus years ago now, but when President Obama was in office, he actually initiated a giant brain research initiative. That's redundant, but you know what I mean, essentially. And it's seen as one of the things we know the least about. It's like the brain, deep space, deep oceans, things along those lines. And because it's like right in our skulls, right? It seems like it should be easiest to study, and yet it can be so hard. Everything that can be invented has been invented, says the head of the US Patent Office in 1899. There are a lot of things in this room that wouldn't exist if that were true, right? I mean, I usually use the example of like, you know, this doohickey that's so important to all of our lives. But even something as simple as this doohickey, this is how I unlock my car, right? Like that hadn't been invented at that time. Cars as we know them were just being invented, right? And so, yeah, this is why research is so important, because if we just stop and say, everybody's done everything, we're good to go, it stymies knowledge, right? And this is how we make advancements. And then there's no reason for any individual to have a computer in their home. Now, this was in 1977 when a computer would be the size of this room, or maybe this room and room 2 combined, right? So then, yeah, that was practical. My grad mentor loved to tell the story about when she had to do her statistics for her dissertation. You actually had to like sign up for a time with the computer, because there was like one, and you had punch cards to program it. She said I would go in between midnight and 2 because it was easy to get that time slot. And so I'm just imagining her like in the middle of the night running these punch cards, right? But now, not so much. Like I've tried to calculate this before, and obviously it depends on what you define as a computer. But again, using my phone as an example, this has more computing power than the Apollo astronauts did getting to the moon, right? So I call this a computer. So my husband and I each have a smartphone. We each have a laptop, right? If you count something like my Kindle, that's a computer, right? My daughter has a tablet. So we're looking at 6 computers in our house alone, right? And I'm sure many of you could kind of count it that way as well. So the idea is we need to keep doing research and we need to keep pushing. And in areas like personality, I think a lot of people will kind of feel we've discovered everything. We got it all. We're good to go. And no, there's still a lot we don't know. And we're constantly coming up with things. Give an example, just very recently, I was part of a study that looked at the big 5 personality traits with classroom engagement over at Chesapeake Bay Academy, which is right behind our softball field. And it's a school for kids with learning differences. And we're finding some really interesting things in terms of, we thought it would be, you know, the kids who were more like outgoing, who would like in person better and who would be more engaged, but it's actually things like kids who care more about their work, kids who are more open to new experiences. So we thought that was really interesting. So what is research? In general, it's the systematic search for facts through use of careful observations and investigations. So only by rigorously testing theories or techniques on a representative group of participants. You'll see subjects here. I like participants better. That subjects implies that something's just being done to them. Participants implies they are like actively participating, right? And that they have agency. And then we can evaluate the accuracy of those theories. We can evaluate the usefulness of those theories and maybe techniques based on those theories. So a lot of the personality theories we'll talk about this semester have therapies based on them, right? And so a lot of times we're testing to see, are these actually helping people? The really tricky thing for personality researchers and really psychological researchers in general is that these are really complex. People are complex. If you're trying to study a theory, they're often really complex. And if you're trying to apply it in a therapy, that's often very complex, right? And so this can be challenging. And so we have to do things like measure unconscious motives, right? How do we make sure we're actually doing that accurately? We have to assess private thoughts. So sometimes people don't want to share those because they're private. And other times people just like don't even realize they're thinking certain ways, right? There are times where you sit back and you realize like, gosh, I used to beat myself up a lot as a teenager or a kid, right? And like at the time you didn't even realize you were doing it. And then monitoring mood changes, right? Like when do you go from being depressed to maybe just a little sad to maybe feeling neutral? That's really hard to determine, right? So these are really challenging things. And so we're always refining our techniques, asking new questions, or asking the same questions in new ways or with new populations. A lot of the research in the past was done on white college males. And now a lot of the research is done on white college females. We're missing huge chunks of the population, right? Even if you just think about racial diversity, ethnic diversity, but also people who are not in college, right? Are their experiences different than the people in college? Y'all are nice, accessible, right? We can give you extra credit for participating in studies. Tracking down those people who aren't in college is more challenging, but important. All right, so the scientific method, which we touched on Friday, is how we do research. So science itself involves the systematized pursuit of knowledge through observation. And observation can take a lot of different meanings, right? I think a lot of times when we think about observation, we think about like counting something in a petri dish, or I don't know, when I was in college, I took an animal behavior class. And one of our jobs was to watch an animal for 20 hours over the course of the semester. So there was a llama farm outside of town, and I went and sat in the field with llamas. And let me tell you, that was like the best stress relief I ever had in college. They're very sweet animals. But it can also be interviewing someone, having someone fill out a questionnaire, right? Observing how they react to something you do in the lab. So observation is a pretty broad way of putting it. So it involves systematically gathering and evaluating that information through careful observations to try to gain an understanding of a construct, of a theory, of people in general, right? So science is really about trying to understand things. And so the objectives of science are description of a personality trait, of a technique that might work to help people in therapy, prediction of what the outcome will be. So for psychology, this is often something like therapy. If I give them this therapy, my prediction should be they will get better, right? If it's not making them better or it's making them worse, we shouldn't be doing that therapy, right? Or maybe that particular person needs to try something different. But a lot of modern psychology is also looking at this in terms of prevention. So what can I do to prevent a disorder or thoughts of suicide, things like that, from ever coming into play? Then control. So we want to control the variables that can be controlled. We don't want to like control people. I'm sure there are evil scientists somewhere that that's their goal, but in general, psychologists are just wanting to control extraneous variables, right? So if I'm doing something where attention matters and a task in a lab, I want to make sure the lab is quiet, will be uninterrupted. One of my colleagues at another university had to throw out half a semester's worth of data because they started doing construction right outside the window of someplace they were trying to do an attention task, right? And so they were just like tried to keep going and they kept getting interrupted, and they realized like these don't accurately reflect these people's actual states, right? And then understanding of personality, understanding of disordered personalities, understanding of why these different things occur and what can be done. And then there are two types of understanding, and I, to this day, do not remember why when I first made this slide, I didn't include both. So we've got nomothetic, but then you've also got idiographic. So nomothetic understanding is really about understanding ideas or big picture. So a nomothetic understanding, nomo, name, it's like a definition. It's trying to describe personality in general or a theory in general. Idiographic understanding is what we do when we're in one-on-one with a person. Idiographic individual. What's going on with this person and how can I help them? So this is what you do in therapy, for example. When we're doing research, we're typically looking more at the nomothetic level of understanding, but some of what we do might be clinical trials for research for different types of therapy. And then we're looking at both nomothetic and idiographic. All right, so we're going to talk about the different techniques that have been used over the years to examine personality research. And really the first one ever, what Freud did, what a lot of early people did, what psychologists still do if they have something that's really rare, is a case study. So in a case study, you have a detailed interpretive description of one person and what's going on with them. So in the case of personality, we might be describing disorders they're experiencing or how their personality traits are negatively affecting them. And it can serve as a great inspiration for research. It can serve as a source of new ideas about behavior. So Freud's theories are based entirely on case studies, for example. It might offer tentative support for a theory as a new theorist tries to kind of figure stuff out in their mind. It can challenge an existing theory's assumptions. You've got a person that's just not fitting with that nomothetic understanding of a theory, right? And it may inspire new therapeutic techniques. I have a friend who wrote up a case study. She had a client with an eating disorder, and she used a technique from a type of therapy called Gestalt therapy. And the technique is called the empty chair. So there's a chair over here. And usually in Gestalt, that empty chair is, your parents or someone in your life who you just have a really hard time articulating what happened to you. So you sort of practice on the empty chair. But my friend had her client imagine that sitting in the chair was her eating disorder. And it was really powerful. Apparently the client started like yelling at her disorder and was like, please leave me alone. So something like that's a great case study where we bring a technique in a new way, and it might be really helpful to other people. So we write it up and publish it so that they can do that. And again, as I mentioned, unusual problems can be studied this way too. Certain disorders are really rare. The movies would like us to think that multiple personality disorder, what's actually called dissociative identity disorder, is super common and like every bad guy has it, right? But in fact, it's really, really rare. So you might see one case in your entire time as a clinician. And so you might write it up to try to help clinicians who will also see only one case, right, in their whole time. So one of Freud's classic cases is little Hans. And little Hans was a young boy who was brought to Freud who was afraid of horses. And now the really interesting thing about this is Freud mostly treated young to middle-aged women or other adults. He didn't treat kids that often. But this little boy's dad knew of Freud and brought his son to be seen by Freud. Freud decided that little Hans's fear of horses was linked to the Oedipal complex. And if you're pulling back to intro psyche, you're like, what was that weirdness again? The Oedipal complex is the desire of young boys to seduce their mothers and get rid of their fathers. We'll go into that a lot this semester and the problematic aspects of it. And Freud saw the fact that little Hans had once seen a horse fall in the street right next to him and was terrified of this experience as insignificant. That didn't matter. It was the Oedipal thing. But individual cases can also help us describe new disorders. So one of the most famous individual cases is Alois Alzheimer. So in the early 1900s, he described a patient exhibiting symptoms of forgetfulness, disorientation, and a general decline in level of functioning. The patient he described was later referred to as having Alzheimer's disease. And so this was the first detailed account of the disease that now we're very familiar with. Case studies and all the techniques we'll talk about have advantages and disadvantages. Case studies, their big advantages, they do justice to the subject. You really look at everything going on with that one person, right? They're idiographic in nature. And it can generate ideas, as I mentioned, for future theories, future research of other types. And sometimes they're just a necessity. Sometimes this is the only way to study it. It's that one person who walks into your office that has something really rare or just infrequent. But as with all of the methods we'll talk about in this lecture, there are also some limitations. So there's no control. Remember, one of the things we talked about is psychologists want to try to rule out all the extraneous variables if we can. And there's lots of different variables and facts that may influence what's going on. And sometimes it's nearly impossible to determine which are actually relevant and which are not. So you can have bias on the part of the person who is writing up the case study, as we saw in the example of Freud, but also you can have bias in the case study subject. So for example, little Hans's father knew of Freud because he was a huge fan of Freud's work. Freud published not only scientific, but basically popular press books as well. And so he had fans. So little Hans's father tended to report information that supported Freud's theory and ignore or de-emphasize the info that did not, right? And this can certainly happen with an individual in therapy just because they like their therapist, they're not attracted to in the like sexual sense, but like they find their therapist very comforting, they like their therapist's ideas, and so again, they might unconsciously or consciously report things that support their therapist's ideas. Case studies also rely on subjective evidence rather than objective things we can actually observe. So just to give you an observation, an example of this. So when I was in graduate school and just learning how to do therapy, we had a training clinic that we treated mostly college students. And we had a rule in our training clinic that you could not diagnose someone with a personality disorder until you had seen them 3 times, because you needed to gather more evidence about that, right? And ideally, you know, we do often don't get this in clinical practice, but you should have evidence from friends, like the study we talked about, or family members. And so this can be really hard if you're only talking to the case study person. Case studies also provide a little basis for generalization. So they're going to describe a specific individual in great detail, but it's often only relevant to that person. And it doesn't generalize to all people in general, or just even all people with that particular issue. All right, next we'll talk about the correlational method. And now just sort of like side story caveat here. For years, the experimental method, which we'll get to on Wednesday, everyone described as like the gold standard. You should only be doing experiments because then you can control as much as you can. The problem with experiments is that they're very artificial, right? You bring someone into this lab space, they know they're being observed, right? And they are, what you're studying is how they react in that weird environment rather than what actually happens in their day-to-day life. So more and more correlation and experiments are both seen as the gold standard. And the author of your textbook actually talks quite a bit about how we should maybe combine all these different techniques to get the best information possible. So that being said, correlational method. Correlation is the degree to which events or characteristics vary with each other. So it's how things vary with each other. So you're looking at the relationship among 2 or more variables. The variables here are assessed as they exist in nature. There's no experimental manipulation. And oftentimes what we're doing in correlational studies, particularly in the area of personality psychology, is giving people questionnaires to fill out, although there are other techniques we'll talk about as well. So they're going to be looking at the strength of the relationship between those 2 variables. And example of a typical study would be you have someone fill out a questionnaire about stress and another questionnaire about depression. And then you see, are those related? Well, we know from years of research, not shockingly, stress and depression are related, right? So in this case, you're not making the subject stressed, you're not making them depressed, you're just measuring those things as they exist in that person. And yes, we have experimental ways we can make people stressed. So for example, one of the ways people do that is they give people impossible math problems to solve, like math problems that don't actually have a solution, and tell them to solve them. They don't tell them they don't have a solution, so they purposely create stress. You would then, at the end of the study, do some relaxation or bring them out of it. Same thing with depression. There are ways you can elicit not full depression, but sadness. in the lab, and often they do this by playing sad music or clips from sad movies. And again, same thing, at the end of that study, you would want to like bring them out of that. You don't want to send people off depressed, right? So in this case, in correlation, we're not doing any of that. We're just collecting how stressed are they, how depressed are they right now in this moment. Perhaps one of the most important things to remember about correlation is that it does not imply causation. So this means if you have a high level of stress and also a high level of depression, you can't say, well, because they're stressed out, they're depressed, right? It could just as easily be they're stressed because they're depressed. I go, what? So it makes sense to us. If you're really stressed out, you're having a hard time handling it, right? You might be depressed because of it. But we also know that one of the symptoms of depression is being so overwhelmed by things and not having the energy to engage with them that it makes you more stressed. It could also be an unseen third variable, such as the loss of a loved one or ongoing 2 pandemics, perhaps, that people are ignoring. I don't know. So there's lots of other explanations. It's also important to think about the magnitude of the correlation, and this is looking at the actual statistic for it. And oftentimes the statistic for correlation is indicated by the letter R. And so we look at this from -1 to +1, and 0 is the weakest correlation. 0 means there's 0 relationship between the variables. +1 and -1 are equally strong correlations. It just tells us about the directionality. And if that is confusing you, I have visual aids, do not worry. Okay. So positive correlation is where as you score higher on one variable, you also score higher on the other variable. So here is that stress and depression scale that we were just talking about. And as you can see, the people who score higher on stress, looks like it was like a 1 to 7, are also scoring higher on depression. Okay, positive correlation. That makes a lot of sense to us. But you can have an equally strong negative correlation. So I just want to flip back and forth here real quick. You can see if I held up a mirror, right, these are the same line, the same slope of the line, just they go in different directions. A negative correlation is as you get higher on one variable, your score on the other variable gets lower. So in this case, we're looking at depression and activity level. And the people who are scoring higher on depression are lower on activity level. Again, here, it's still hard to figure out causality because we know that a symptom of depression is engaging in fewer activities that you enjoy. But we also know that when you're engaging in fewer activities you enjoy, you're more likely to be depressed, right? Or it could be maybe you broke your leg, so you're stuck in bed, right? And so both things are happening because of that. Then there's no correlation. That's R equals 0, 0 correlation. So this means there's no discernible pattern. So in this case, we're looking at depression and intelligence, IQ. And we know that you can be of any intelligence level and be depressed. You can also be depressed at any intelligence level, right? If we flip that around. So no relationship here at all. There are several extensions where we take the idea of the correlational method and we use it to answer broader questions. So epidemiological studies, looking at things like incidence and prevalence of psychological disorders or physical disorders. Incidence is the number of new cases that emerge during a given time. The way I remember this is there's an N in incidence and new. And then prevalence is the total number of cases in the population during a given time period, right? So we think about this with COVID, incidence would be the number of new cases, let's say in a day or a week. Prevalence would be the number of people who have tested positive in the population in whatever amount of time. And so this little graph down in the corner is actually the prevalence of depression among different age groups and by gender. So you can see it tends to peak, unfortunately, during college age for especially women. All right, and we are out of time, so we'll wrap up this slide and keep going on Wednesday. Thank you for going along with my random idea this morning. I think hopefully it helped a little to think about how things are reported. And I will see some of you in a half hour and some of you on Wednesday.